It's high time to get the low down on mediums. Jo Sonjas have been kind enough to send me some of their mediums to try, and when I say some, I mean something of every variety. Flow improvers, glazing mediums, drying inhibitors, and ones to change the finish of our paints. They're all classified as medium, so it begs the question, what is the difference? The goal of a flow improver is to change the consistency of the paint to be less viscous. Ultimately, we want it to also not mess with the properties of the binder holding the paint together. Water is technically a flow improver, and a little bit can help loosen up paint quickly, but too much and we start to mess with the properties of the binder holding all the pigments together. That's why day-old paint left on a wet palette won't paint the same as something fresh. Too much has been replaced with just water and can leave paints looking chalky or dusty. Flow improvers are also important for airbrush work. If the flow improver is already the right consistency for going through your airbrush, then all you have to do is add some paint. Something too thin and you might get spidering, and something too thick and it will struggle to spray. So a less viscous flow improver is good for a thicker paint you don't want to dilute too much, while a more viscous, but not too viscous thinner is good for making a paint more transparent for airbrush glazing, since you won't need that much pigment. When making your own quick washes just on the palette, these are the types of medium you'd want to be using too, because the point of a wash is to have a thin, flowing paint, but by using only water, you'd end up with coffee stains, while flow improver will settle the pigments much more appropriately. When I talk of adding medium on my channel, usually this is what I'm talking about, using it to thin my paint instead of water. Glazed mediums are another one that kind of tells you what it does right on the tin, and that's to reduce the transparency of a paint by diluting out the pigment, but without changing the consistency or control you'd have of the raw paint. While water can be used to dilute out a pigment, its low viscosity means you have to really take the moisture out of the brush before applying the glaze. Otherwise, it'll behave more like a wash than a glaze. And still, you have to control where you lift your brush to prevent too much pooling. With the glazed medium instead, you can get a diluted paint with the same consistency of a normal paint, so it can paint with it more normally, and should dry in a thin, even layer. A lot of techniques I use the airbrush for can instead be replaced with a glazed medium for a brush alternative. Adding hue shifts over already painted surfaces, you want them to be more even over the surface, and that's exactly what the glazed medium does. Another one that gets in your face like it's posing for a UFC poster to tell you what it does is drying inhibitors. They slow the time it takes for your paint to dry, giving more time to work with it when doing things like wet blending. These are really important if you live in a very dry climate. Adding these to your paint will cause them to dry a little slower, but like all the mediums on this list today, it will still dilute out the paint a little bit. Laws of the universe just be like that. So a very little goes a long way. And unlike other mediums, too much goes an even longer way, a very, very long way, in that if you try thinning your paint with this, it may never actually dry, so should be used in conjunction with other mediums if you need to thin paint and have it dry slowly. The other thing to be careful of is when using them on a wet palette. Paint mixed with drying inhibitor on the wet palette will tend to pull much more moisture from the sponge, effectively thinning out the paint. So when using it, either use a dry palette or make sure that what you want is a thin paint. Vegetable glycerin found in the baking aisles of supermarkets usually are the homemade version of this one. It can be used just straight with other mediums or thinned with a bit of water first. So if you live somewhere dry and secluded, this might be the best option. But, and I am going to gush here a bit, the Jo Sonja stuff works so much better and doesn't mess with the properties of a paint. Not only that, it's also useful for keeping brushes healthy. When done washing your brush for the night, using some of this medium will help keep the shape of the bristles, but will not dry in them, so washes out easily the next day or however long it takes to get back to painting. So if you want more working time with your wet blends or paints in general, I highly recommend this one. The last thing mediums can do for us is change the finish of the paint, meaning make it glossy, satin, or matte. Most of the time, you'll find that one of the mediums already mentioned comes with a finish modifier. So something like this satin medium is a glaze medium, but will dry with a satin finish. Or conversely, I like to use the Green Stuff World Max Matte as both a thinning medium and something to make my paints dry more matte. If it doesn't have one of these modifiers included, then it'll dry mostly whatever the paint's natural finish is, depending on how much is used, though they do have their own finishes as well, so if there's not much paint in it, it will default to its own finish. Most of these can be used as sealers as well, not quite a varnish, which I'll get to in another video, but something you can use to set the paintwork already done with a little bit of a protective layer. This becomes really useful if we want to change a finish to make a wash behave differently on a surface, or if we're about to get a bit messy and need something we'd be able to clean mistakes off of. Please subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this one, or just other fun things to do with painting miniatures. And until next time, enjoy your own painting journey.